Hey guys, what's up? Fantasy art as it is now is pretty much evolved from fantasy art that it was during the day. And we're talking about the day, like the beginning of art, there was fantasy art. There was like people drawing things that were like in fantasy stories, fantasy art, just like anything that people talked about. Um, in any story people told each other, people would draw and paint and it would become fantasy art. Fantasy art now is amazing because it really is the power of the people right now. I mean, really is the power of the people, just like talking, like literature is the power of the people, or like talking, saying what you think is the power of the people. Like everyone's got their cell phone and they're on social media with a bunch of people that are interested in the same thing, and they're always just like saying what they think because everyone has the capacity to access these resources. Everyone has a capacity to create fantasy art or any kind of art they like, but fantasy art mainly, everyone has the capacity to do it. Everyone has a pen and everyone has paper or a pencil and maybe some markers or paints or something like that. Just like it's not that difficult to attain. Back in the day, it was almost impossible to attain, and paints and pigments, they were very low tech. They were like egg tempera with water. They mixed it with eggs and oils and things like that, and they had pigments that were like shipped from all over the world, and it was like really hard to attain. And then the canvases were made of all kinds of things, cotton and all kinds of vine. I don't know what they made canvases out of. Canvas, I guess, right? But they made them out of all kinds of materials, paper, wood, and they were giant. They were huge. And paints and brushes, all of these things were really expensive. And also it was really hard to learn how to do that and how to like actually do it. You kind of don't have to learn anything about it. You just start doing it and then you just get better as you do it longer. But the thing is that like back in the day, there was fantasy art, and the original, like if you go to museums, you will see the old fantasy art, and it goes back, I mean, it goes beyond like the Greeks and Renaissance and the Egyptians. I mean, if you go back to the first civilizations, Assyrians, you will see fantasy art. I mean, you will see like what we see today as fantasy art, and we call fantasy art. Maybe they saw it differently, called it something differently, but the art was the same. It had fantasy elements in it. Like the old Assyrian sculptures, they were like these, sort of like these human bird-like heads with these wings and sort of like this bird body and stuff like that. If you go to the museums, you'll see that. And Assyrians and Sumerians and Mesopotamians, and these were like the first cities ever created. And before that, there sort of were cities and stuff like that, but before that, like the oldest art were these cave paintings. And were they fantasy? I don't think they were really fantasy at first. Some things were fantasy, like about it, but like some things were like realistic art. Or it wasn't realistic, it was sort of like representative art. It was like, someone would like paint a buffalo or something like that, the stuff they would see. But then there would also be like these other sort of fantasy things where people would paint these spirals and stuff like that. So people started like to use their imagination and create art based on like, like spirals or just things that they had in mind and stuff like that. And then you go to the Assyrians that had like, they started like really trying to, and then they started actually to paint their stories. So I guess first they would paint their hunting experiences, and then they would paint their stories. So the old Assyrian myths and the stories that they told each other, they were stories, whether they were myths or just stories or folk stories or someone's religion, or they were just stories actually, because stories are stories, whether you believe in them, whether you don't believe in them, they are still stories. And from stories, there are descriptions of characters and things and people and stuff like that, monsters and beings. And whether they exist or not, it doesn't matter because they're described in those stories. And so people that read that story and hear about that story, they want to draw that. They imagine it, and they're like, okay, well, there's this like bird person with wings, you know, and a human head in the story, and so I'm going to chisel it into stone or draw it or paint it on a wall. And then you got the Egyptians, where there were like human like bodies with like animal heads, and animal heads with human bodies. Like, it's interesting how they did that. It was like one or the other. The Sphinx was an animal with a human head, and then all of the gods were like human bodies with animal heads. And they would just like switch it back and forth. You know, but that's basically fantasy art, because it doesn't really, it's not a physical thing that existed that we're like, oh, look, a flower, let me draw this flower. That's physical. You know, this was, no, it's a flower made of fire, and then let's draw that. And that's not physical. That's not something that exists. That exists in fantasy. That exists in a story or the imagination. So anything that exists in the imagination that you draw is fantasy art, whether it's got like classical fantasy elements or not. And you will see like there became like a difference between like imaginative art, creative art, art that people just drew, that maybe was a person, you know, with a person's head, and maybe also there was fire around that person's head. Or if you look at some of the surrealism of Dali, you're going to see like melted clocks and people coming out of eggs, and you know, like all kinds of like elephants being kind of like held up on stilts and whatever. It was just like, his stuff is just bizarre. But it's all, he just takes it to the next level. Like, he takes fantasy, he makes it into something that just, it's like his fantasy. It's like, this is what he imagines. And it's like, we're like, whoa, he really, his imagination is just like far out, you know, it's intense. And so, and then so you kind of had that. Then you kind of had like the medieval and Renaissance fantasy, where it's like stories of mythology, stories of religion, Medusa, and that like the old Greek fantasy, like the Perseus holding a head of Medusa, a woman's head with snakes for hair. You know, that's fantasy. And whether that's, it doesn't matter if it's myth, it doesn't matter if it's like someone believes it's real, it's a story. And it's about something that's not in the 3D world. It's about something that's in the imagination, right? And whether that's real or not, it doesn't matter, because it's still in the imagination. So it doesn't matter if dragons are real or were real or once real or not real. It doesn't matter. There's still fantasy art because they're in the imagination, you know? It doesn't matter if like there was ever a Pegasus, a horse that flew on wings, or exists somewhere right now. Even if it's in another dimension or another planet or something like that, it doesn't matter, because it's in someone's imagination. It's part of a story. It's been described and it's been drawn, and it's fantasy art. And so you go into this part of fantasy art, and I think this is the modern day, I think starting in the middle of the 19th century, when paper, pencils, paint, markers, paints, ink, like canvases, when these like materials became accessible by everybody, or you don't even need a canvas or anything like that. Like, every kid, you know, gets paper and a pencil at school, and what do they do with that? Do they like write notes? No, they draw with it. Every kid draws with their pencil on paper. And so, you know, because it's just so much more interesting. Like, you're listening, you're sitting in a class, and you're going to draw like a cool thing, rather than listen to some boring, I don't know, like class talking about some stuff that's like, whether, you know, who knows whatever it is, you know? And that's always just more interesting. It's like, if it wasn't more interesting, it wouldn't be in museums. Museums are just art without any of that. There's no math in a museum. There's just art, you know, unless you're in like a museum planetarium, and then there's math. But that's cool math, because it's like engineering spaceships, which is like, and like satellites and stuff. That's awesome. And telescopes. So, you know, so yeah. So then you got something that happened to fantasy art in the 19th or 20th century. Something happened where fantasy art follows fantasy stories. And yes, you can draw something that's just art. You can, but usually it's from a story. Like if you go to the museums and you'll see art of the Renaissance and stuff like that, or the Greeks and whatever. In the Renaissance, people made art of Medusa. And there's lots of art of Medusa. Medusa was a popular story back then, and people make art of that. Now, did they invent Medusa? Well, no, it's from a story, and that's where fantasy art like came from. Like eventually, it was from stories. Whether they were biblical stories, they were still stories, and they still had fantasy elements in it, whether you believe in biblical stories or not. Because early fantasy was mythological, but like some people believe that it's real, and some people that's their faith, and other people just see it as a story and tell it as a story. And I think it works both ways. And because it is a story, and because it is about things that are not of this world, it is a fantasy story, and from it comes fantasy art. And so like after all of these stories were there, and there weren't a lot of stories back then. It wasn't a lot of reading. There weren't a lot of books. And so like what happened in the 19th, 20th century was that the printing press came out, and writing books became something that everyone can do. The typewriter came out, everyone learned to read and write, whereas in the past people didn't know how to read and write, and people would write stories. Also, pigments, art supplies, they became really, really accessible. And so more people were able to like get those art supplies and make art. And a lot of what happened was people would make art based on the stories that they read. So, they wouldn't just make art, they would also read the novels that were coming out at the time. H.G. Wells, some of the Victorian novels. When the printing press came out and novels became a thing, and they started being sold in stores, and they were printed very, very quickly and efficiently, people started writing stories. And some of those stories were realistic, right? Just fiction about like, some of them are nonfiction, biographies and people's lives and whatever. Of course, like biographies, people might have changed that around also, and then made it a little bit fictional, and no one knew the difference, to make their life look more exciting or whatever it is. But then H.G. Wells and some of those writers came out, and they started talking about time machines. They started talking about like floating airships. They started talking about going into the past or the future. They started writing stories about the old myths that were just told as myths, but they were like the King Arthur myths of the Knights of the Round Table with Merlin, and in that there were like wizards and dragons and swords, and that really became the medieval times were glamorized. And people thought, wow, it's so cool, the medieval times, the dragons and flying horses, and knights and chivalrous knights and evil knights and kings and queens and grails and magic swords and evil, like evil characters and whatever that are trying to thwart the good characters and stuff. The fight of like the good and the righteous against the evil. And so people would start writing about that, and it became a genre, and it became something that more people started writing about. So then you got the early part of the 20th century, which is like Conan the Barbarian, John Carter of Mars, even H.P. Lovecraft's stories were, even though they were, I would say his stories are thriller stories rather than horror stories. I don't think H.P. Lovecraft stories are scary. They're spooky, and I think they're thriller stories. I don't think they're really horror. They're not like horror, really scary freaking monsters. And they're just scary, they're spooky, but I don't think they're like horror at all. He's okay. He's a good writer in my opinion. I never got too much into it. I've read his stuff. I just never got hooked too much on it, but I could see what people see in him. So that's also that's also fantasy, sort of. And anything where there's things that are like not of present reality is fantasy. So a world where there's magic that's prevalent is fantasy. A world where there's spaceships traveling throughout the galaxy, it's sci-fi, but it's also fantasy. It's sci-fi is fantasy, basically. It's just you're taking technology and you're accelerating it into what it could be, and it's still fantasy, but it's in the future. So it's like a subgenre of fantasy. And so what we got at that point is that we had these books that were coming out and they had to be sold. And what's interesting is there was a industry that came out called fantasy illustration. And fantasy illustration is when you go to look at those books that came out in the 60s, 70s, and 80s in the fantasy sci-fi part of the bookstore. And I mean, if you just look at the older versions of those books, they're still in good condition because they're you know, it's sometimes they're still in good condition depending on how they're kept. But you're going to see it was a whole bunch of people that came out that were very, very significant. Michael Whelan, Boris Vallejo, Rowena Morrill, a lot of people, a lot of artists were into that. They were into fantasy, and they weren't just like into drawing and painting. They were into drawing and painting fantasy. I mean, that was their thing. And what happened was that these books had to be sold, and they would put them on the bookshelf, on the book racks, but they needed like some way to really sell those books. So they would get artists to do covers for them. And so if it was a fantasy book, they would get a fantasy artist to do a cover of it. Someone that knew how to draw things that looked otherworldly, whether there were spaceships or monsters, barbarians or knights, wizards or dragons or horses with wings, or unicorns, or, you know, any of those, or even like elves and dwarves and things like that, like the Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings stories that came out before, also like in the 20th century. These stories were like coming out. People were writing them. People were writing stories based on fantasy, and so like after Conan the Barbarian and all that stuff, I think in the 60s and basically I think the 70s were like more significant for fantasy, because in the 70s, all of these stories just all of a sudden came out. And there were a lot of writers doing fantasy story, whether it was Isaac Asimov who did sci-fi, or like Piers Anthony, Michael Moorcock, you know, and all of these guys, and you know, J.R. Tolkien and George R. R. Martin, who did Game of Thrones. That came out, I think it was in the 80s that it came out with the first story, whatever, the first book, or something like that. So in the 70s it came out and went into the 80s. And it really came out in the 60s, and that kind of started it all. And I think by the 70s, it was a real genre. It was a real career for people, that these stories, these books, that they would need a cover for. And you would they were going to these people that knew how to draw covers, or knew how to draw fantasy, Boris Vallejo and stuff like that, who knew how to draw fantasy, and Mobius. And they would be like, well, you know, can you do a cover for this story? And some people would actually read the stories. Michael Whelan supposedly read the stories before he made the painting for them, which is interesting because they're 300-page books, a lot of those, that he did paintings for. And it'll take him a little while just to read the book. And he would actually read the whole book, I think the whole book, but he would read the book and he would get this impression of what the book was about, and he would make this painting for it. And so they would take these paintings and they put them on the book covers, and they were next to the comic books and everything, but they were in the book covers, and they were fantasy stories with the fantasy genre, and they had spaceships and they had monsters, and they were in the past, and they were medieval times, and there were knights and wizards and all kinds of different stories that were otherworldly. And all of these artists, I think in the 70s is when I really saw the art really, really stand out. That art really stood out, because these artists were really, really good. And they still are. They're still around. They're still really great artists. But they were doing amazing stuff back then. And then in the 80s, like every single book, every single fantasy book looked amazing. And it looked better than any other kind of genre book in the bookshop. Because every other genre, maybe it was a detective book, so there'd be a picture of a detective, you know, hiding behind a doorway with a magnifying glass or whatever it is. And that'd be cool. But then you look at this one, it's got these like magic creatures and this like wizard, you know, shooting fire, or there's a knight with a sword like combating like another knight who's in black armor and with a sword, you know, or like someone riding a dragon, like Dragon Riders of Pern or something like that, you know. You know, and all of those, that whole idea, it really took off because like that art really sold the stories. And that art was created by those stories. And the people that created that art did not just make art for the book covers. That was just one of the things they did with their art. They would make fine art that was fantasy. They would make fine art and they would have these sort of like these like elements, these fantasy elements, men with swords, women with like skimpy like metal like metal like bikinis, like the chainmail bikinis on Red Sonja and whatever, and there were magic wands and there was whole stories that were involved and evil forces and wizards and stuff like that. And so those stories took off. That became a huge genre, and in the bookshops it was a whole section. There was that one, there was the science fiction, which was like next to it, but it wasn't mixed in. It was like science fiction was separate, right next to it, but it was the fantasy. And you'd look at it and you would see the best art in the world on those book covers. The better the art than any other genre of book cover. It wasn't even close. Like, it was amazing art. Like, people would buy the art. People would buy the book because the art was like, this story's about this picture. I want to dive into this picture and I want to experience the story. You know, what is this art? And, you know, and so a lot of the artists, you know, they would get paid maybe like $1,000 or $2,000 or whatever it is at the time for the art, but then they can take their painting, the actual physical painting, and if they're popular, depending on their reputation and their customer base, they can sell their painting for $10,000, $20,000, which means that like they would make the painting for the book, but then they would actually sell the painting, and they also made prints out of it, and they could sell prints and things like that. And so like they're still selling that print that they made in the 1970s. People are still buying that print and putting it on their wall because the actual painting was so much cooler than than just like the book jacket, the book cover. And I did hear stories about people that just bought, I mean, a lot of people bought the book just for the art. You could pretty much, you know, like buy the book. I mean, the books weren't expensive. Like the art was like, the book was like, I don't know, like $3 or $6 or something like that at the time. And then just for the picture, it was worth it. You know, they maybe would read the book or like wouldn't read the book, but they would take the picture off the front of the cover of the book and maybe put it on their wall or something like that. Or put it up on something so they could look at the picture because it was just so compelling. It was just so nice. And so, and now it's like, they've gone away from that. They don't really have a lot of fantasy illustration on front covers of books. I find that the covers of books now, they're not imaginative. They're not like creative. They're not cool. They're not good. They're like, there's a little bit of a symbol there and it's not the same fine art or same illustration that was on those books in the beginning. Like you look at a fantasy book now, and I think that's also why there's been a decline in fantasy. There's been a decline in fantasy books. Like I think there's just not a lot of quality books at this point. I'm sure that it's gonna go back up, and some really good authors are gonna make some amazing, compelling books. But there just hasn't been a lot of compelling books. I mean, there's a lot of different fantasy that's coming out now, which is like, you know, there's the young adult fantasy, the urban fantasy that's coming out. There's a lot of subgenres of fantasy that are really, really cool. I think comic books are like really cool right now for fantasy. If you love fantasy, then comic books are like the thing to do. Even though there's some novels that are really cool, but their covers are not that great. like those guys do not really, they're still called upon to make covers, but it's not like they make those covers all the time. They just make them like sort of once in a while, and a lot of book covers are just you know, unless it's the same cover that they've been putting on that book since the 80s or 90s or something like that, and it's still like a good book cover, and then it's still good now and stuff like that. So yeah. And so it was sort of a combination between the fantasy stories and the illustration of the fantasy story, the art that went with the fantasy story, that propelled art and fantasy art into what it is now. And what it is now is the capacity for anybody to create any fantasy story, because all it takes is imagination and liking that kind of genre, you know, and also in the same imagination as in making a fantasy story, as in making a fantasy painting. You know, it just takes imagination and trying to make it physical, make it on paper. And yeah, so, you know, that's the progression of fantasy art and stories through time. And let me know what you guys thought of the video, and I hope you liked it. If you did like the video, like and subscribe to the channel, and I will see you guys in another video. Take care.